In this video lesson, we'll discuss the emergence of Abraham Lincoln into the political arena, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, as well as John Brown, the abolitionist. Abraham Lincoln ran in an Illinois senatorial election of 1858. Senator Stephen Douglas's term was about to expire, and Republicans decided to run against him, a rustic Springfield lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was born in 1809 in a Kentucky log cabin to impoverished parents. He was completely self-educated. He shone in his frontier community and spent some time, among other pursuits, as a splitter of logs for fence rails. Lincoln's private and professional life were not especially noteworthy. He married above himself socially, and the temperamental outbursts of his high-strung wife, who some people called the she-wolf, helped to school him in patience and forbearance. He gradually emerged as one of the better-known trial lawyers in Illinois, although still accustomed to carrying important papers in his stovepipe hat. He was widely referred to as Honest Abe, partially because he would refuse cases for which he had to suspend his conscience to defend the Illinois courts. The rise of Lincoln as a political figure was not rocket-like. After making his mark in the Illinois legislature as a Whig politician, he served one undistinguished term in Congress from 1847 to 1849. Until 1854, he had done nothing to establish a claim to statesmanship, but the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act lit a fire within him. After joining the Republicans, Lincoln emerged as one of the foremost politicians and orators of the Northwest. Lincoln had almost received the vice presidential nomination. As a Republican nominee for the Senate seat, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of joint debates. The senator, Stephen Douglas, who can be seen pictured here, was probably the nation's most devastating debater, and Douglas promptly accepted Lincoln's challenge in 1858. 7 meetings were arranged from August to October. The polished Douglas presented a striking contrast to the lanky Lincoln. However, old Abe also had a very piercing, high-pitched voice and was often not well. But as Lincoln threw himself into an argument, he seemed to grow in height, while his glowing eyes lighted up on a rugged face. He relied on logic, not just shouting. The most famous debate came at Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln trapped his opponent on the horns of a dilemma. Suppose, he queried, the people of a territory should vote slavery down. The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision had decreed that that was not legal. And what should be done about that? Douglas's reply to Lincoln became known as the Freeport Doctrine. No matter how the Supreme Court ruled, Douglas argued, slavery would stay down if the people voted. Laws to protect slavery would be passed by territorial legislatures. The upshot was that Douglas defeated Lincoln for the Senate seat, and the Little Giant, as Stephen Douglas was called, had loyalty to popular sovereignty, which still had a very powerful appeal in Illinois, and made the election very decisive in his favor. In the general election that followed the debates, more pro-Douglas members were elected than pro-Lincoln members, but the districts carried by Douglas supporters represented a smaller population than those carried by Lincoln supporters, so Honest Abe had clearly won a moral victory. Lincoln possibly was playing for larger stakes than just being a senator. Newspapers in the East published detailed accounts of the debates, and Lincoln began to emerge as a potential Republican nominee for president. Douglas, by winning the senatorial debate, actually hurt his chances at being elected president and splintered his party. After Douglas's opposition to the Lecompton Constitution for Kansas and his further defiance of the Supreme Court at Freeport, Southern Democrats were determined to break up the party and the Union rather than accept Stephen Douglas. John Brown, murder or martyr. John Brown of Bleeding, Kansas now appeared again. His scheme was to invade the South secretly with a handful of followers, call upon the slaves to rise, furnish them with arms and ammunition, and establish a kind of black free states as a sanctuary. Brown secured several $1,000s for firearms from Northern abolitionists and finally arrived in Western Virginia with some 20 men, including several African Americans. At Harper's Ferry, he seized the federal arsenal in October 1859, incidentally killing 7 innocent people and injuring 10 or more. Slaves were largely ignorant of Brown's strike and failed to rise up and join him, and the wounded Brown and the remnants of his tiny band were quickly captured by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. Old Brown was convicted of murder and treason after a hasty but legal trial. His presumed insanity was supported by friends and relatives who were trying to save his neck, but Brown, who truly believed that God wanted him to help the slaves rise up and kill their masters and become free, was known as God's angry man, and he was given the opportunity to enjoy being a martyr. He was clever enough to see that he was worth much more to the abolitionist cause dangling from a rope after a hanging than any other way, and he was very dignified and courageous on trial. His last words, "This is a beautiful country," were to become legendary. His conduct was so exemplary, his devotion to freedom so inflexible, that he took on an exalted character, however deplorable the actions that he might have committed. Brown plunged into world fame, and the effects of Harper's Ferry were shattering. In the end, John Brown became a martyr to the Northern cause. In the eyes of the South, Brown was a wholesale murderer and an apostle of treason. Many Southerners asked how they could possibly remain in the Union while a murderous gang of abolitionists were facing armed bands. Moderate Northerners, including Republicans, openly deplored what he had done, but the South concluded that the violent abolitionist view was shared by the entire North. Abolitionists and other free soilers were infuriated by Brown's execution. Many of them were ignorant of his bloody past, and they were outraged because the Virginians had hanged so earnest a reformer who was working for so righteous a cause, which was freeing the slaves. On the day of his execution, Free Soil centers in the North bells tolled, fired guns, lowered flags, and held rallies. The ghost of the martyred Brown would not be laid to rest. And there's even a song about John Brown that was created that was sung very commonly during that time period. We'll discuss more about the impact of John Brown's raid and the impact of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in our classroom lessons in class.